I'm gonna tell y'all something. This game right here is the reason why you should never, ever forfeit a match. Anyway, what's going on? Mully is back, and welcome to the final match from the 2014 batch of games for the Diamonds Are Forever series. This time I'm going up against bleezemon. I hope I'm saying that right. Could be bleezemon. Anyway, this is a DPP OU match. For those new to DPP OU, keep in mind that there is no team preview since it didn't exist in the Nintendo DS games. We're still using the same team that you guys saw in my last battle that I posted. I'll probably leave a link to that right about now. If you want to watch that one first, make sure you come back here and watch this one afterwards. This battle is pretty epic. It's definitely one of the better games I had back in 2014. Anyway, as you can see, I'm leading off with Crobat. My opponent has a Gliscor lead. I'm going to go ahead and start with the taunt, not wanting to try for any first turn predictions. My opponent knows what lead Crobat does, and U-turns out to reveal a Rotom Heat. Now, this got me thinking that Rotom could be Choice Scarf. Although in hindsight, if you saw a Gliscor lead back in 2014 and even before then, it usually meant your opponent was either running a semi-stall team or going full stall. But regardless, I try to scout for Scarf with Swampert, and I catch a Will-O-Wisp instead, unfortunately. And this really hurts my Swampert, but I'm just going to go ahead and set up the Stealth Rock anyway. For now, I'm putting Rotom on a Will-O-Wisp Pain Split defensive set, and my opponent decides to reveal Starmie here. And I'm actually going to stay in to set up the Stealth Rock again and just sack Swampert now, so I can try to keep rocks on the field by scaring Starmie out with Jirachi. And my opponent does go for the Surf and unfortunately gets a crit. And then here I make a pretty big misplay and completely switch plans by going to Zapdos and keeping Swampert as death fodder for later, not realizing that it will be impossible to do that if my opponent gets a single hazard down due to Pert being at 1%. And my opponent makes me pay for it by going for the Rapid Spin, so I am not off to a good start. Here I immediately just go for Thunderbolt to keep my opponent honest, but of course he switched out and revealed Tyranitar, who takes absolutely nothing and shows leftovers, which means this set is extremely bulky. And I don't even want to stick around and try to Toxic this thing yet and catch a potential Stone Edge. So I go ahead and reveal Jirachi here, and my opponent shows the Payback, which immediately told me that this was likely a Curse Tar set. But I want to keep momentum going, so I'm going to decide to U-turn out here, predicting the switch. And my opponent does reveal Skarmory, sure enough, so I end up going back to Zapdos in response. And now that Skarmory's out here, I'm actually going to pull a double switch here, and I'm going to decide to reveal Infernape, predicting Tyranitar to come back in so I can start doing some damage to this team. I did this because after seeing 5 out of 6 team members, this is definitely looking like a semi-stall team with Curse Tar as the sweeper. But my opponent stays in though and actually goes for Stealth Rock, most likely realizing that Stealth Rock effectively kills Swampert. So I get a bit of momentum this turn because of the Stealth Rock though. So I take advantage and U-turn out and try to keep it going, and my opponent actually brings Starmie back in and takes a huge chunk of damage. And the damage shows that this is the standard Rapid Spin set and not the super bulky bold set with Reflect. And because of this, I want to keep the pressure up, so I bring Jirachi in to try to finish this Starmie off. U-turn is a one-hit KO from Jirachi, so I go for it. Naturally, my opponent switches back to Gliscor, and I really don't have a switch that can threaten Gliscor, as my team is pretty heavy on physical attackers, so I just go back to Crobat. And here I'm just going to go for the Brave Bird to try to wear Gliscor down a bit. And Gliscor can't really touch Crobat either, because since Crobat's immune to Toxic, and typically Gliscor's only attack, the only attack that Gliscor's carried at this time was Earthquake. So he just U-turns out, and the U-turn typically actually means that Gliscor is not carrying either Taunt or Toxic. But anyway, Skarmory comes back in. I thought my opponent's plan was to just Brave Bird here, since I showed Taunt on Crobat turn 1. So I just take the chance to Roost, and my opponent actually pulls a double switch back to Rotom. Leftovers basically confirms that this Rotom is some type of defensive set. And it's here I decide to just go ahead and sacrifice Swampert to see whether or not my opponent tries for another Will-O-Wisp. And unfortunately he doesn't, and he's just going to go for Thunderbolt, which still doesn't tell me much. But because Rotom is a bulky set, Venusaur does outspeed it. So I go ahead and reveal Venusaur here on the free switch. And I'm going to lead off with Sleep Powder, based on the fact that Rotom does not outspeed Venusaur, and I do manage to connect with it, confirming my suspicions. And then I'm going to switch to Zapdos, predicting Skarmory to come back in, as it's my opponent's best response to Venusaur. But surprisingly, instead, my opponent decides to reveal his last Pokemon too, which actually turns out to be a Celebi, likely expecting me to go for the Grass Stab. This isn't that bad for me, because now I get a chance to scout the Celebi set, and my opponent immediately shows that he's running a Calm Mind set. Goes for the first Calm Mind here, and I show that I do carry Heat Wave on the Zapdos. Now, because Celebi outspeeds Zapdos, I'm not going to be able to stay in and spam Heat Waves, especially if my opponent is carrying Recover. So I have to go for Toxic here to keep him from boosting up and trying to sweep. I land it, and my opponent does show the Grass Knot, which usually means that the other two moves are Earth Power and some type of support move if this Celebi is not carrying Recover. But it turns out that my opponent is carrying Recover. So I'm going to Roost up here, and now that all the cards are pretty much on the table as far as team members are being shown, Venusaur can sweep if Skarmory and Celebi go down. Jirachi and Infernape are also possibilities to sweep my opponent's team, depending on what gets knocked out. But you guys will soon see who the real MVP is. Anyway, I go for Heat Wave again to force Celebi out, and Tyranitar comes back in. And because this is likely Curse Tar, I felt pretty safe switching Infernape directly in. If T-Tar is carrying Stone Edge, he would have to hit first and then not get a low damage roll. But my opponent ends up going for Payback. And I decide here that I'm just going to U-turn out again, because I figured I would have one more turn to do stuff with Infernape, and I didn't want to stay in and try to do damage to a full team with it. My opponent brings Gliscor back in, so I just go back to Jirachi in response. And it's here that I'm just going to immediately lock into Ice Punch, because I could one-hit KO Gliscor as long as I get a decent damage roll and my opponent stays in. But Gliscor is actually going to end up living this Ice Punch, and the damage tells me that Gliscor either has some EVs invested in defense, or it's running Impish Nature. And my opponent gets to U-turn out and goes back to Skarmory. And unfortunately here, I end up making another misplay. I decide to go to Zapdos when I should have gone to Infernape. Given the makeup of his team, Skarmory was likely carrying Spikes in addition to Stealth Rock, and I really should have picked up on it. My opponent does end up showing it here, and because of that, that layer of Spikes basically KOs Infernape as well. Because as soon as Infernape comes back in now, it's going to go down to the hazards. But here I just go for Thunderbolt, because I have to force Skarmory out at this point, and having two layers of Spikes and Stealth Rock down on my side will absolutely devastate my team. And my opponent picked up on it, went back to Tyranitar, and now I'm in a really tough spot, as I can really only bring in Jirachi or Venusaur, and Skarmory will force out Venusaur no matter what. So I had to go to Jirachi, but now this means Jirachi can't switch in anymore either. So I'm basically down 3-6. So I really should just forfeit at this point, honestly, but I decide to stick it out and just lock in the Iron Head. And here I get a few flinches for the next several turns, thankfully. And I really don't know why my opponent ended up staying in here with Tyranitar. before finally going over to, and then he goes to Celebi after this, after taking a couple Iron Heads, and then I get some damage on Celebi with Iron Head, and then he's finally actually gonna switch back to Skarmory. This really confused me quite a bit. My only guess, the only thing I could think of, is that he didn't know that Jirachi was scarfed, but now that Skarmory's in, I'm forced to switch out because I can't let Skarm get a full stack of hazards on my team. So I'm gonna go ahead and fodder off Infernape now to see what he goes for, and it actually turns out to be Whirlwind, so I catch a little bit of a break here. So that gives me a chance to go ahead and bring Zapdos in on the free switch, and I really need to get rid of the Skarmory at this point, and taking out Celebi would be nice too. So I have to Thunderbolt here, and of course my opponent is going to switch back to Gliscor to absorb the Thunderbolt. But now is the time where Zapdos shines and goes absolutely insane. So here my opponent is going to go for the taunt, probably expecting me to roost or go for Toxic, but I thought it was a bit strange because I did show Heat Wave against his Celebi earlier, and I just go for it here and get the KO. Notice that I was not the victim of Sandveil hacks versus Gliscor at all this game. Everything I needed to land, I hit. But Starmie comes back in. My guess is that either my opponent's trying to bluff Ice Beam or he doesn't know Zapdos is especially defensive. I am absolutely staying in because the rest of my team is weak to Ice Beam anyway. But regardless, I know he doesn't carry it. He goes for Surf. It does not even 2-hit KO, and I knock out the Starmie with Thunderbolt. Now Tyranitar comes in, and I just decided to just pelt it with Thunderbolts, but I get a crit and 1-hit KO the Tyranitar. Zapdos does not care right now. The crit very likely mattered, as the only way Thunderbolt 2-hit KOs standard Curse Tara from that range is if I get the max roll twice in a row and the taunt wears off. And my opponent is pissed right now, so he brings in the Sleeping Rotom, as that's the only thing left that can really stand up to Zapdos. So I just roost up, and Rotom ends up waking up, but he went for Sleep Talk, and it just gets worse and worse from my opponent here. And now we finally see this is a Rest Sleep Talk set with Will-O-Wisp and Thunderbolt, so it's most likely max defense. But now that I know the set, I just go for Toxic to start wearing this Rotom down. But I'm finally gonna miss, and the Rotom does land the Will-O-Wisp. I have to go for Toxic again though, and this time I connect, but I have to take a Thunderbolt to do so. Now this Rotom can't necessarily beat Zapdos one-on-one, because if I roost and he goes for Thunderbolt, Zapdos will actually resist it. It just depends on how much PP each Mon has left when they face off against each other, even with Zapdos having pressure. But anyway, I have to roost here, and my opponent knows this and decides to bring Celebi back in. Celebi coming in is also a little weird, since Zapdos could potentially beat this too. I start off with Toxic, so I can limit my opponent from boosting up too much and with Calm Mind and doing any type of Calm Mind spam, basically. And he's gonna go for the first one. My opponent goes for Recover after this, and I'm just gonna roost up again. But my friends, my colleagues, Zapdos is not done. Zapdos is not done. Not yet. Now here Rotom's gonna come back in, and of course I have to go for the Heat Wave with the Celebi being in here, and I land the Heat Wave, and I get another crit, making Heat Wave a 2-hit KO. Now of course I have to go for it again, and I land it the second time and I get the KO. And Thunderbolt here had a high chance to OHKO as well, but it wasn't quite guaranteed, and I didn't want my opponent to rest off the damage. I believe the percentage to KO with T-Bolt was slightly lower than the 90% chance to hit with Heat Wave. I'll leave a calc up on the screen so you guys can check it out. But my opponent is going to bring Skarmory back in and double switches back to Celebi to bait the Thunderbolt, and he gets the prediction right. Going for T-Bolt as opposed to Heat Wave wasn't that bad, because if I did miss, it was likely going to get blown out by Whirlwind. And then Zapdos takes Stealth Rock damage when he comes back in, so I didn't want any of those shenanigans. So I pretty much have to roost again here. And my opponent does take advantage and starts boosting up again with Calm Mind. And then my opponent's going to go for the second Calm Mind here. And once again, I go for the Toxic to keep my opponent honest and keep him from spamming Calm Mind and just sweeping the rest of my team. And eventually to force the Celebi out. But it's here we're finally actually going to get to see the coverage move that this Celebi is carrying. And it does turn out to be Hidden Power, which is not surprising. But it does neutral damage to Zapdos, which means that this must be Hidden Power Fire. But Zapdos is still not done, and I go for the Heat Wave and get another crit and KO Celebi. Who can stop this man? No one can stop this man. This Skarmory definitely can't. And I pretty much have the game in the bag. I just go for Thunderbolt. To no surprise though, this is especially defensive Skarmory, which actually makes things a little better for Venusaur, but not really. My opponent Whirlwinds me out, because who can blame him at this point, as there's no reason to keep switching around. And Venusaur gets dragged in, and I'm just going to stay in at this point, as there's no reason to even keep switching around. So I go for Sleep Powder. Is going to connect, which gives me a chance to get a free Swords Dance to try and do some damage with Power Whip. And that's pretty much the game. Skarm's going to end up staying in hibernation. Power Whip is now a 2-hit KO with the boost. And I managed to land it. And that's going to be the game. So Zapdos, this man just fried everything and showed no remorse at all. But this is why you never ever give up in a match, because you never know what's going to happen. You could be so far behind, and all of a sudden, because it's Pokemon, anything could happen. They can all just turn around. And I don't have the words. I have nothing else to say. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys like what you saw, hit that like button just below the video. It helps me out immensely when you do. And if you didn't like it, then hit the dislike button, but at least let me know in the comments as to why. And if you guys don't want to miss the future stuff coming down the pipe, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Links to all the social clubs I hang out at are in the description box below. Twitter, Google+, all that good stuff. Anyway, stay tuned for more, and until next time, I'm out. Take care, guys. Peace. Team Instinct, because all the other teams suck.